Thank you all. Thank you both for coming. So this is a very special talk in which we have some speakers in Saigon and some speakers plus our co-moderator in Germany zooming in. So we are starting now, and the talk would start with Betsy, our co-moderator and co-curator of the whole online discourse program, to give us a bit of introduction. Yes, Betsy, over to you.
Thank you, Tra. Hi, everybody. Hello to Saigon. Unfortunately, we cannot be there. We would very much like to. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am Betty Chen. I'm dramaturg and co-curator of this year's SPR Festival. We have a focus called Where Memories Meet, where we focus on the different memory practices and artistic strategies, especially of the works from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. The reason why we chose this is because we think it's high time to look at these historical memories from a more global perspective and no longer looking at the stories and artworks in a strictly separated regional manner. So it's not a regional studies like many other theater festivals do, but we do have a focus on the context more on this region of the world, but then the aim is actually to find more potentials for connections and to understand, as we see in the news now, actually many fronts and many histories do have a lot of interactions and influence on each other. Yeah. And so for this purpose, we have this series of talk called Situating Memories, and today is our second talk. And the reason why that's part of the, so to say, the method that we prefer to have it online, so that we could have not only like today, the two artists groups from very different backgrounds meeting and talking together, but also a different encounter with audience sitting somewhere else. Because we think theater, that's basically the core of theater, is never just one work or just one audience. And we hope by doing this, this SPR International Festival can be really contributing to this international talk and conversations. And SPR Festival is a biannual festival taking place in Munich, always in autumn. So this year will be on the 20th of October to the 4th of November. Yeah. And so I would go on to introduce our first group of speakers as Hans-Werner Kroesinger and Regine Dura. They are, you can say, the pioneers of documentary theater in Germany. And Regine, she works as a documentary film director, a dramaturg, and an author. And since 1996, she has worked freelance in the field of feature and documentary film for, among others, the European Film Academy and Wim Wenders production in Berlin, as well as a film curator and jury member. And since 2000, the two have been collaborating together and won numerous prizes, among others, the Stolpersteine. This project, we will also hear from them today, was invited to Theater Treffen in Germany. And Hans-Werner Kroesinger, he's been working with prestigious directors like Robert Wilson and Heine Müller already in the 80s. And since 1993, he has been working in several prestigious municipal theaters in Germany. The two of them has been doing all kinds of different formats of artwork. Back then was not understood as theater, but now very much so, and trying out a different format of engaging theater and society and history for more than 20 years. So it's our great pleasure to have them here. And I hand it over to Tra.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and well, it's always a pleasure to share ideas and talk about work and get to know another artist who's working in the same field. And that's the advantage of doing something for a long time, that then you become a pioneer. So I can tell the people who just start to work on something, stay with what you do and continue, and there will be the day you're a pioneer. What Regine and I are doing, it's a very simple thing, because what we do, and therefore it's a pleasure to be invited to this panel about memory. We deal with history, and history is always something which is in the making. And history, of course, has a lot to do with some memory, with personal memory, with official memory, and forgotten memories. And these the stuff we work on is with documents. We do interviews. Some critic wrote about us. We are somehow like an office for unwanted questions, because there is always an official way of telling the story. But as we know, most of it in history is lost, because it's not recorded, or it's a document no one has shown it, or it's a blocked document. It's nothing to, it's not obvious. So what we try when we do the research, to find as many different ways into the subject as possible, and then create a theater situation, because the theater is a perfect place to deal with this kind of stories, with this kind of narratives, because you are there in the company of strangers sharing an interest in the same issue, but everybody's coming with a different background. And so in the theater, together with the performers, we can share what we found out about the issue, about the situation, about the story which is told. And this creates a kind of conflict between the official storylines and the personal storylines. And conflict is always a good thing for theater, for drama. And so these narratives start to work against each other, and to open doors which we don't know that they were even there. And this is the most difficult work, and this difficult work is Regine is doing this because she is dealing with the text. So she can tell you how this is working.
Well, the starting point, or the starting spaces of many of our endeavors are archives or libraries, or talks with people, interviews. Well, in 2015, we were invited by the Staatstheater Karlsruhe to do a play on the eviction of Jewish actors and actresses and singers from the theater in Karlsruhe during the National Socialism. And the great thing about that was that we had access to a theater archive that no one really had dealt with. So it was a treasure for us to have access to all these documents. And reading through these documents, we tried to also go through personal files in order to find stories of people, of the actresses and actors, and some of them are only, how to say, contained in files and documents. So we selected four stories for actresses and actors, a prompter, where that was, so to say, the starting point into this evening.
And it's interesting because, of course, everybody knows that what happened, or everybody thinks he knows what happened during National Socialism. But it was interesting to see what was happening inside the theater. But because theater people always like to believe that they are somehow better, higher moral values than other people or so. But when you looked into the files, you saw, no, it was not. It was just the same. It was like the focus. You could see something which was happening in the whole society. And of course, it was happening in the theater too. So there were actors who were banned immediately. There were actors who didn't want to play with the other actors continuing during the stuff. Then it was an awful story. And the most shocking thing was that how the story continued after the war, because it was not over when it was 45. Regine said we had chosen these 4 characters. 2 of them died and 2 survived. And one of them, an actor who survived, he came back to Germany after the war and he continued playing, but he had to play with people who were very prominent during the Nazi times. And before he had big parts, and suddenly he was only playing small parts. Or the prompter, for example, she survived a concentration camp, and after the war, there was a chance to apply for state money to get a kind of refund for the time you spent in the concentration camp when you survived. But for this, she needed official documents. And when she applied, it's a theater, she wrote, I need official papers. The guy who was in charge of the archive at this time told her, we are sorry, we have nothing about you. And when we were there, 60 years later, we found a bunch of files just dealing with her. So it was very obvious that the people who were in charge then didn't want to help her. So she still had to struggle again after it. And the way the form we developed then for this play was that we chose, in the beginning, our set designer, who is a visual artist.
Maybe well, one more thing, maybe. We started in 1917, that was the rise of the National Socialist movement in Karlsruhe, the city where the theater is. And we ended in 2015, that was the year of the production. And for us, it's always necessary or a given that even if we start in some point at some point in history, we will try to bring it to nowadays, to our situation, to questions that we are dealing with. So this is so to say the timeline, and then we always, not always, but we a lot of times we use different settings for the space, and there it was important because the stage designer designed we have 4 different stages, so to say. It starts with the people sitting at the table with the 4 actresses and actors who are reading from the files and then starting to act, and they are sort of part of this of this setting. They are in between 2 screens, and we can show a couple of photos maybe so that you can see the setting of the space. And from there we talk about the National Socialist takeover of the theater and the eviction of those Jewish actresses and actors and singers, which was happening in no time in 1933. So in like 5 months, there were no Jewish actresses and actors and singers longer employed at the State Theater at the theater in Karlsruhe. So that was one point. But the other thing we were interested in was looking at the city like through a magnifying glass, because so we were reading through newspapers, and everything can be valid when we start going to archives or to libraries. So we were using advertisements, or we were looking for notes on the blackboards in the theater just to find out about what was the restrictions, how fast did they take course. So maybe we start showing some pictures. Let me see whether we can share the screen. So that's it. And there are some parts of the text that are translated into English, but I will go to the images. So this is, well, you can't see the setting here, but you can see. Yeah, okay.
It was important that the actors stand together with the audience at the table. So it starts as if a big group is visiting an archive. And what they have there is a lot of archive material in front of them. and they start going through the pages and start reading, talking, and then it gets more and more into acting during the 2 hours of the show. Another kind of acting. Of course, they also do acting when they look into the archive.
Yeah, and it starts with the audience sharing the space with the actors and actresses, and it ends with the tables being turned into an archive. So we will see the photos later on. So these are...
That's a very good. There you can see you can have the image. The audience is sitting in between, and when the actors talk about sharing documents, you need the help of the audience, because the documents are passed by the audience to the other actor, and if he doesn't get this document, the show doesn't continue.
Yeah, and we found one document. It's a document that was sent to all Jewish households about the deportation. And of course, it was not called deportation. And it was an administrative document with a very violent language that was hiding all the true facts that we know about from nowadays. And that is the turning point where the situation where the audience shares the table with the actresses and actors turns into another setup. Let me try to see. Okay, maybe at first. So these are the 4 actors, actresses. This is one actress. She was a promising young actress who died in Ravensbrück in the concentration camp. This is Emma Krantheit, the prompter. She was a furious woman who was writing letters and trying to stand up for her rights. She was the only one, not the only one, but she survived and fought also after the war for her rights. This is Paul Gemmeke. He took his own life. And this is Hermann Brandt, Hans-Werner talked about. So these are the 4 people, life stories we are talking about in the play. So after the audience has left the stage, this is the situation. The audience is in a sort of normal frontal theater situation and looks onto the stage. And this is the part where we start talking about the post-war times. And in the end, we end up in an archive. So this is after the show is over. The actors have laid out the part of the documents we were working with and invite the audience to look through the audience and talk to them as well.
And what's really nice about this part with the actors, the actors leaving the stage, and the material is there for the audience, that the people they hang out. Some of them hang out for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, as long as it's possible, to have a look into the document, and they start talking to each other, because of course own stories come up and own family stories come up, and yeah, suddenly it changes into something else.
And also when we work, we also always try to include the actresses and actors with own texts. So we encouraged them to write their own texts, and we included those texts. And as well, during 2015, it was a time of one particular right-wing movement that started in Dresden, but spread out to different cities in Germany as well. So Karlsruhe was one of those cities where this right-wing movement held weekly demonstrations. And they held the demonstrations on the same route that Hitler took and the National Socialists for their big celebrative festivities. And what was interesting for us is also that the actors were engaged against and held demonstrations against this right-wing movement, and so we included this as well into this evening.
And it was also interesting because one of the actresses, a very young actress, she said that she lives in a very old building in Karlsruhe, which was built in the 1910s or so. And she said suddenly she started thinking about what was happening inside this space she was living in, what was happening there in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. What spirit could you feel? What happened to the people who lived there? And she started asking around what was the story of the building.
And we had a lot of guest plays with Stolpersteine Staatstheater that brought us to China or Romania, Lithuania, and Israel and other countries. And what was interesting for us is that we always had talks after the performances that brought us to the situation in these countries. And I think that had to do with the fact that we were trying to closely follow up the administrative force that was put upon the people, the segregation, the way of segregating people, how the laws were changing, how civic rights were taken away from the people. And that was interesting and important for us to have something that is universal, so to say, so that you can talk about it, because we are all in danger, you know. Things can quickly shift anytime. So
it's good that Regine mentions this, because, for example, in China, we had a very old actor coming, and it was really difficult for him to come to the theater because he was really aged. He was more than 80. And he came and he saw the show, and after the show, he came to us and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, I'm thankful that you did this presentation, that you did this show, but there are so many memories from the time of the Cultural Revolution coming back to my mind. I have to go home now. I'm thinking of people I haven't thought of for a long time. And of course, it's striking when you realize, when you experience something like this. Or when we were in Poland, there was a historian inside the show, and he said, this part where you describe how the cultural system is changing, how special authors are banned, and suddenly plays are launched for a special idea. That's all what is happening right now. And that theater directors have to leave the country because they're no longer able to work. And that's what Regine said. It's just because when you work on something in detail and very carefully and very precise in the process, you realize it's a system. And people can relate to the system, because in the beginning, we were honored that we were invited to China because of the Theatertreffen. But of course, we were very afraid, because we thought, what will people do with a show like this? 2 hours, a lot of talking, and they have to read all the time, but it works. It works because the audience becomes a part of, somehow you also become a creator, because you start filling in your own experience, your own memory, and what you think about your own society. And that's the reason why it functions. And that's a place where what you can do in theater. We did a lot. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I mean, time-wise is great. Yeah, but that was I remember I also saw the show live in Karlsruhe, and I was maybe just 2 things to make sure. I'm not sure whether the idea of Stolperstein, this German word, is known. So it is this like a square, roughly so big, in metal, and in front of the properties of the Jewish people whose home were taken away from them. And then, so quite some cities in Europe, they have this practice of having these stones and also carved right into at the doorstep in a way. So if you walk on the street, you were step on it, but trip by it. That's why the idea of Stolperstein, that you trip on it and then you think. And on the stone, it's written their names, their birth and death year, and where they were deported, where they ended up, so to say. And I also remember this. I think that was a very good example of how the theatrical space actually changed our physical perceptions of things. Because in this, like Regine and Hans-Werner just now said, it was several times change of audience members' relationship to what is presented. I also remember, because it was in a city theater, means a lot of the audience is from that city and they know the city. So so imagine if it's in Saigon, and then the play really talk about the history of Saigon, and then listed the photos and the routes. And then so you have it very vivid in mind what happened. And I think that's also why this evocation of the memory is possible. So personal memories, that is. Yeah, Tra and Dean, sorry, Dean, I meant to introduce you first, but we very happily start our conversation. So maybe I hand it over to Tra.
This one, okay. Just a few words before we hear from Din. When we talked about the series of talks, we were really interested in finding out, in exploring how fictionality either emerge or is engaged in historically informed artwork, and thus giving us a different take into history and into memory itself. So we were fortunate to be able to invite Dinh Q, visual artist whose work, including photographic works, video installations, and films, have been challenging the effect of history, and specifically that of the Vietnam-American War. And maybe, yes, I'll pass it to you so that you can share with us a few things.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. It's kind of, I've never speak at a theater festival before, so it's kind of nice. I guess I'm gonna give a little bit of background of where I come from, and that will kind of inform how I work. I was born in Vietnam during the Vietnam War in 1968, which is the height of the Vietnam War, and lived through the war. And in 1978, my family escaped Vietnam, and we end up in the refugee camp in Thailand, and eventually resettle in America. And so I was 10 when we end up in America. And for the next 15 years, I was living, kind of in the valley of the American life, so to speak. And then in the 90s, kind of early 90s, I started to come back to Vietnam. Vietnam just reopened. And by 1997, I decided to move back to Vietnam, and I have been back to Vietnam all these years now. And anyway, so that's kind of my experience. And so that kind of informed quite a bit of what I do, because when I was living in America, wanting to learn about the Vietnam War, and you end up learning it from the college and university courses, and it's all about American experience in Vietnam. And so that was kind of frustrating for me, because there was this class that I signed up for. It was one of the most popular class at UC Santa Barbara. It was a lecture of 500 students, and you have to be junior or senior to sign up because it's so popular. And I believe it was featured on national television in America, 60 Minutes program for like 2 or 3 times, because it was the first class that deal with the Vietnam War. And but what happened was, when I was in the class, the professor would invite American vets to come and speak about their experiences in Vietnam. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, wait a minute, I thought this is about the Vietnam War, and where are the Vietnamese perspective? Where are the Vietnamese stories? And so I went to ask him, and he's kind of embarrassingly kind of telling me that he hadn't been able to find anybody who's willing to Vietnamese American who willing to speak about their experiences. But that's a little bit a little bit of a cop-out, because there's 2 million Vietnamese living in America, so I'm sure there's... And so that's kind of led me to start to really understand how history is being written. It's written by, you know, there's a saying that the victor get to write the history. But in this case, the American actually lost the Vietnam War, and they actually write the history anyway, because they have the capacity, they have the ability. And at that time also, Hollywood was producing all these Vietnam War movies. And if you look at it now, it was only until later, much later, that the Vietnamese in these movies, we are the shadow in the jungle. We are the farmer wear black pajama who doesn't say anything, or we are the prostitutes on the street. And again, we are not, the Vietnamese perspective was not included, and the American didn't give a shit about our perspective or our experiences. It was all about their experiences. So again, so I was growing up in that environment where the history of the Vietnam War is being written in that particular way. And so out of that frustration, I start to do research on my own about the Vietnam War. And then, so I start looking at documentary images. And again, the documentary images of the Vietnam War was also another interesting aspect, because all of the photographers that document the Vietnam War were foreigners. They were journalists from the West, and some from Japan. They came and they document in a particular way. And so there you have another kind of version of Vietnam, and it's from a very different perspective. And that's how the world also saw us, Vietnamese, only through those photographs, because they were published widely throughout the world during the Vietnam War. And so that's how the world saw us, and they still saw us. This is back in the 90s. And then, you know, so between the documentary and, so I thought about another, you know, how do I kind of intervene and insert other narratives that are being that are kind of how do I insert my narratives in there? And so this is a project that I started in 2003. And I was looking at all these kind of memories in a way. So in particular, my personal memory, there's the 3 sets of memories about the Vietnam War. So on one hand, I was growing up in America, so I ended up watching all these Hollywood movies. And that's how, you know, in the 90s, that how the world also saw the Vietnam War is through Apocalypse Now, through Born on 4th of July, all these movies. And they play a very important role in how the world, again, saw Vietnam and saw us and saw the war. And so they dominate kind of the popular imaginations of Vietnam. And then, of course, the second set of memories that dominate Vietnam was the journalists, photojournalists, that was taken during the Vietnam War. And as you know, while these journalists, they do try to accurately document the war, but at the same time, of course, you know, a happy photograph is not going to sell newspaper, and they're not going to win a Pulitzer Prize or you know. So there is a kind of a focus on the most horrific representation of Vietnam can possibly happen in order for the newspaper to get to sell newspaper, for the journalists, photojournalists to win the Pulitzer Prize, build their reputation. So there's a kind of bias that whether these people are real, I mean, their heart perhaps might be in the right place, but their personal interests that kind of play against it as well. So you have this two set of memory, and then so I start what I did with I want to insert my own personal memory, and so what I've been collecting kind of vernacular photograph of Vietnam, from Vietnam. These are images that the world never get to see. These are images of people going everyday lives. They're happy images, because when we make a decision to take photograph of an event, it's a happy moment that we want to remember. And this vernacular photograph, this kind of snapshots that I've been collecting over the years, are a documentation of happy moments that took place during the war, and yet, you know, the world never get to see them. And so what I did was I start to cut the photographs up. So I blow up still from Hollywood movies. As you can see, these are some images from Born on 4th of July, the color one particularly, and images from The Quiet American. And then they are insert with black and white photographs also from that were taken during the Vietnam War by journalists. And I also take images of everyday life of Vietnam and cut them all up and start to weave them together. And so these work are literally a weaving of three sets of different images. So you see in the middle is the cowgirl in the Apocalypse Now, the Playboy Bunny actually, yeah. So and Martin Sheen on the other side, and then there's an image of from the Vietnam War, as well as an image of a beautiful young Vietnamese woman who I found in a thrift shop. And they're all woven together. And what I was interested in is how all of this three set of different memories are merging. When I was living in America, I was watching movies, I was doing research about the Vietnam War, and also my own personal memory of Vietnam. They all are merging. And that kind of, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference from one another. I remember when I was in Simi Valley, my mom lived in the valley in California. and there was a fire in the hills. And smoke was everywhere, and it was orange, of course. And if you look at the Vietnam War movie, it's the orange color. It's always orange. The smoke is always orange. Anyway, so I was in the backyard, and there's fire in the hills, and helicopters flying, smoke was everywhere, and everything was orange. And my first thought was, wow, this is like the Vietnam War. But then I caught myself, because my actual memory of the Vietnam War doesn't have helicopter and fire and smoke. And that's memory is coming from Hollywood. And that was what's kind of interesting, how all this memory are merging. And it creates this kind of landscape of memory that's neither fact nor fiction. It's somewhere in between. And if you're not careful, you find yourself in this place that is, you can't tell the difference anymore. And so that was this series that I was really interested in. So I start also insert the MGM logos and Columbia logo into the work to talking about how all these fictional memories and personal memory and documentary memories are all merging and mixing. And so these are literally weavings. My aunt taught me when I was very young in Vietnam how to do grass mat weaving. So when I was in college, I just started blow up all these photographs into large photograph and cut them to strip, and I start weaving together. And so that's this series. And so from that project, I was thinking about Hollywood, about how Hollywood have been dominate our memory and how they write the history of the Vietnam War. And so in 2005, I was reading a newspaper. It's kind of fascinating story. Maybe I'll go back a little bit. Now, Vietnam is still a communist country. And today, it's somewhat of a neo communism. I don't know what it is. But information is still heavily controlled. And so over the years, the history of the Vietnam War have been highly controlled by the government. Now, somebody like me who come from the South see the war very different as somebody from the North. Now, the North called the Vietnam War the American War. And the South see the Vietnam War as a civil war between the North and the South, between the idea of communism and democracy. And of course, if you're somebody else from the West, you'll probably see it as American invasion of Vietnam. So that's it depends on where you are. Our perspective of the war is very different. And so when the war is over, the Northern Communist government took over Southern Vietnam. They decided to control the narrative, and they want to expand the narrative that is not a civil war, but it's more of an American control. It's American war. The American was trying to basically take over Vietnam. And so when the war is over, the communist government took over, that narrative was really important. And so one of the most interesting thing about after the war ended, now if you imagine 1975, when the war is over, the country was in total chaos. Economically, we're a mess. There's not enough food in Ho Chi Minh City. But within 5 months, the War Remnant Museum, what's called now, opened. That's how important it was for the government to open this museum. And the museum primarily was trying to educate or the Southerners that the war is not a civil war, but is a war against American invasion. The problem was nobody went to this museum because the Southerner refused to go to this museum. Anyway, so that's kind of like the and even today it have changed a little bit, have relaxed a little bit, but the narrative of the war is still being tightly controlled. And so this project, what I was really interested in is that I was reading a story about these two guys in the countryside. They live about 4 hours from here in a one-lane street that's near the border of Cambodia and in Tây Ninh area. And this area used to have a huge US military base. And these two guys, when they were young, they saw the helicopters taking off and landing. And as you know, the Vietnam War was the first helicopter war. It was the first war that the helicopter were armed. Before that, it was just used to evacuate the wounded in the jungles, but Vietnam War was the first one. And these two guys, when they were little, they actually fell in love with the helicopter. And anyway, but what's really interesting is that because the fact that we're not allowed to really open, discuss, and deal with this horrific history, the war, that sometimes I find it's like the way this memory kind of manifests, and it comes through in such an amazing kind of surreal way that you just couldn't imagine. So what happened with these two guys was that in 2005, they decided to build a helicopter from scratch because there's this kind of madness of somehow this kind of manifestation of this memory that have been kind of holed up in them. And so this was their first helicopter. What they did was, it's a life-size helicopter. It wasn't just like a tiny little toy. It's a life-size helicopter, and I'm happy to say that today this helicopter is in the collection of Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's kind of fitting because the American brought 5,000 helicopters to Vietnam, and we're able to bring one helicopter back to America. So anyway, but the thing is, they just kind of fascinated by this machine. And this machine for so long, in their childhood was a kind of, brought all this violence. And if you watch the video, they talk about it. And this is their workshop in Tây Ninh. This is just like a one-street town, a dirt street, basically. And they were just kind of making this helicopter. And they wanted to transform it from this war machine, this death machine, into something useful. And what they wanted to do was to create this helicopter to help farming, for spreading the herbicide or to spreading fertilizer. And they never able to kind of fly it because they don't know how to fly the helicopters. But also we never know whether it's actually can move and according to them can lift off the ground. But nobody dared to fly it because it's so dangerous. Anyway, so, but what's really kind of fascinating for me was that it was a manifestation of all this kind of memory of all this kind of our experience of the war. And this was displayed at MoMA in New York with the video. There's a link to video, so if you can watch it later. And so what I did was I was looking at how Hollywood have always been telling the Vietnam War story. And so what I did was I took clips from Hollywood movie, but only clips of the helicopter. Because for so long, the American only speak, and we, the Vietnamese, don't speak anything at all in these movies. And so when I make this, when this movie, I decided that to only get the Hollywood clips of the helicopter, so none of them would speak. It's only this sound of the helicopter. And to allow these two guys and his relatives, who also the same age and a little bit older, talk about their memory and how they encounter the helicopter and what they do and what they see the helicopter today. For what the imagination of this helicopter is. But what's really interesting about this whole thing was their helicopter was a reflection of this Vietnam desire to move forward from the war, to move forward from this kind of images of war, of death, of destruction, and to transform it to something else. And when they first made the helicopter was known in the press, the government confiscated it. So the local government took the helicopter and impounded it because they said that this is a dangerous machine. They don't know what they're doing. And what's really interesting was that the scientists, the engineers start to write in the newspaper and say, we'll help them, whatever they need. And then this kind of groundswell of support. And it was kind of fascinating, and you see the kind of, I think they tap into something of Vietnam at that time that want to kind of to rewrite or maybe not rewrite, but to write a new chapter of Vietnam. And so there's this desire for modernity, to something to help them with farming, but also to transform this horrific object that was, brought so much death and destruction to Vietnam. And they want to kind of transform it to something else, and everybody in the community were coming together and supporting them. And what happened was the government basically released the helicopter back to them. And so that was kind of wonderful. And so I went and I met them, and we start this project. And so now, it's kind of interesting that the project now is part of a museum in America. But I think this is where so many, what I'm interested in, how history can affect the way we, well, maybe not history, but how we kind of come to terms with so much of our history. It's really interesting. My friend, Moira Roth, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. She's a historian, and she coined this term called obdurate history. And obdurate history is a history that refuses to go away. It doesn't matter what you do. You try to erase it, you try to hide it, it will find a way to come through. And I think in many ways, I think this is what I've been observing, how what came through in Vietnam over the years is kind of this amazing manifestation of so many things that you can see that it's actually the root of it come from the war, and it come through because we haven't been able to deal with it openly, and so it just kind of find a way to come through. That's sometimes it's the most surreal thing that you can have, and anyway, so that's why I'm so kind of fascinating with history, with memories, and how we deal with it, how we come to term with it, how we try to kind of. I think, you know, there's so many questions, you know, like, of course, you know, we cannot hold on to every memories, but the question always for me was like, what to let go, you know, how can you, which one to let go and which one to keep? But then, you know, maybe the one you let go still will find a way to come through anyway, in different way, different form. But that's why it's so fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the sharing. And I find it really fascinating stories. And I especially like this, really I guess I can call it some kind of idiosyncrasy of people, but that it actually tells so much. It was so personal, but it tells so much of, and I can imagine that people also could have their own reflection about it. But before I ask questions, I wonder whether Regine and Hans-Werner, you have any comments or questions?
What I really like very much as a craft is the weaving of photographies, the weaving of different memories or constructed memories, like in Hollywood films, and because you create encounters that never happened to a certain extent, and create a whole new, very intense and multi-layered space that you can enter with your own memories. And this I really liked, and combined with the craft of weaving, because the weaving is one string goes up and then it goes underneath. So it's always the visible and the invisible together, and that's so great. So I found it
really striking, because all these these layers of the picture, well, as Regina told about the layers, but I also found it interesting, just very simple, to talk about the American War or the Vietnamese War. So that's a very clear perspective. It's a very clear distinction between telling the stories, and that you got into it through a personal experience because your professor invited people talking about the war, but of course only the veterans, American veterans. And as we know, they don't have so much space in the American society to talk about, and it's very strange that when you suddenly start talking about the war in Vietnam, that then you only invite the veterans and you don't invite anybody else. It's of course it immediately starts raising questions, and to me I liked it very much because of course I have seen a lot of these Hollywood movies. When you talked about it, I immediately realized that one of the first movies I've seen dealing with the Vietnam War was this film from Hall Ashby, Coming Home, about this veteran. And of course, when you're 15 or 16, that's striking. You see something and you see it's a Hollywood narrative, but somehow it's still striking because you look at it and you think, ooh, but there is this, even in this film, he is asking the question, what kind of war was this? Was this a legitimate war? Was this, what was he fighting for? For whose interest he was fighting for? And it was really interesting to see this as a youngster. And now, well, thanks to your work, it brought back this memory, seeing it when I was a long time ago.
Yeah, I think, you know, like as you in your work as well, there's so many layers in history, and as in your work, how you unearth layers that have been hidden. And I think this is where the weaving, in some way, is about that. It's about all this layer that, you know, one on top of each other, and which part get seen and which part get hidden. And this is why I'm kind of really kind of interested in the weaving as a kind of way to kind of talk about the many layers, but you don't get to see all of them. You only see certain part. And it depends on where you stand, certain things come through. And I think this is where, you know, in your work as well, you brought things up, and you brought audience up into the stage. And of course, where they come from, where they stand, where their history, you know, that's also brought them into another place where they can see what you guys present differently than probably your actors and your, you know, even yourself. And this is where it's really interesting, where it's I think maybe what we try to do is to give a kind of space for people to kind of experience it from different perspective, different kind of way of looking at things. Yeah.
And what
Sorry, please, Regine, you first.
Oh no, I just wanted to add one thing about the weaving. The striking thing as well is that there is no domination of any one picture. It's just a layering, because it's, you know, it's the combination of several pictures.
Actually, there is because I changed the weaving method. There's certain thing that I want to push forth, then I bring forth. So it's not like one up, one down. There are areas that I skip that completely. So you see some of the Hollywood images very prominent, and then sometimes the vernacular photographs with the documentary photograph are all kind of fragmented and woven together, and they kind of become this kind of fragment because when I was making this work, I always felt that Hollywood is so dominant in our memories that this other memories, they're kind of fragmented, and they're trying to come together to trying to fight this dominancy. And that was kind of why I developed this process where I skip and kind of high and things like that too. Yeah.
And you allow for encounters.
Right.
It's just, and this is different perspectives, you know, and it's building spaces. The same thing that we try to do with Stolpersteine, Tripping Stones State Theater, to create different spaces that you could enter and that allow for different experiences.
It's what I like watching your pictures was that, of course, these Hollywood movies, they have a as I would call it's a big echo space. You see one image, you see the helicopters, or you see 4th of July or so, and immediately you have all the surroundings. But at the same time, you have this picture from the private photo collection, and then it collides. And this collision, I think, is interesting, because this collision, well, it immediately starts raising the question of the dominance of the value of pictures. We did a long time ago, we did a play about where there was an agency called Corbis, and they started buying the rights, visual rights, from all different departments or so. And they had this beautiful phrase, create beauty, create opportunity, realize beauty, inspire success. But it was all commercial, it was just from a commercial perspective. And we did a play dealing with the question, what happens if an agency like this owns all the material to a historic event? And what happens if an agency like this can change it in a way however they like, because they are in possession of all the information, all the visual information about it. And somehow the work you do reminds me a little bit of this, because you do these collisions of the big echo spaces of the Hollywood films and the small private collections, and suddenly they become on one format. They create another space.
Yeah, I feel when I was listening to the both of you, I felt in a way you were both, although in very different ways, but dealing with the arbitrariness of what is remembered and what is being said. And because, like you have said, it's not possible that everything is remembered. It's simply not possible. But then to make things simple, they are made very often, and no, they are very often so one-sided for good or bad reasons. So one-sided. It could also be very often is political attempt behind it, but very otherwise, when I think of this helicopter example, I feel it was also so that what does perception mean? What was the impact meant? It's many layers, but then usually at the political and historical level, the geopolitical level was an easier one to be expressed. But this awe or this longing or this affinity to technology was something that's a lot vaguer, a lot more vague, and not. But it nevertheless shaped the person. And but of course, you still put it back. What does it mean in this whole historical perspective? Why do the personal psyche work like that? Maybe it's because you were, of course, not. It's not like a thesis saying that's because, but it's suggesting many different ways. And I really think, in a way, I also felt I was the same with what Regine and Hans-Werner did it. Although on the surface, it didn't seem it didn't deal with idiosyncrasy of people. It deal with system. But I felt it was also this, because people, although system is so big, but people overlook it. Somehow they feel, I don't know, we have this tendency of understanding systems as, so we personalize them. They are the bad people, and somehow bad people did bad things to us. But we ignore the systems and how systems move us. That was my comment, but I have one question. Actually, earlier, one thing Dinh said was really very much my own problem now. I'm currently working on a theater production that partly, as you can say, talking about the second generation Vietnamese immigrants in Germany, based on a novel. But we also invited younger performers who has this different cultural backgrounds and talk about their experience and so. And yeah, in a way, it's yet another perspective on the Vietnam War, because it was this connection of, it was basically the clash of the German environment of this more 68 movement against American, and while the student from South Vietnam, he's completely confused. Why is Germany supporting the enemy? So anyway, that was the backdrop. But what I want to ask was, in there, we did have problem with representations, of course. And I remember one time we thought about showing some historical photos of exactly this prostitutes on the streets of American soldiers, with encountering American soldiers. And at some stage, we had a reflection, some team feedback saying we shouldn't make things too soft. It was so brutal. So we should confront the audience with difficult, like, you know, this super men patronizing woman, so Americans patronizing Vietnamese, this kind of terrible photos. And I felt I almost couldn't accept it. And I thought, since when am I becoming so, I thought I was too conformist. I didn't want to confront this violence or anything. But when Dinh was talking, I think my problem was, why do you have to make Vietnamese face prostitutes again? I think my problem was that. But of course, I had the problem of, but if we don't do that, then it's just a very entertaining, comfortable man and woman dancing picture. So I was wondering, both of you, when you were doing work, when you face this kind of classical representation issues, how do you make your choices? Is there because you have one assumption, or you have, I guess you don't have a goal where you go to, but when you, let's say we all are very aware of this sensitive problems of representation, that one step after another can lead to very different interpretation of things. And you're experts in this. I just wonder whether you can share with us any struggles you had or any discoveries you had in your work, so to say. Well, especially both of you were dealing with this very, how should I call it, very well received, very complicated things like Vietnam War or the Holocaust. Am I clear? So, I mean, this repetition of classical representation or, yeah.
Well, yeah, well, we had one situation when we did a play on the Nuremberg trials, historical setting of the court setting. It's the Nuremberg court where the trials took place. And we had found a set of images that showed the night of the pogrom. And you saw, I've never seen pictures like that. You saw the Germans intrude in the privacy of Jewish apartments, and you saw the violence. You saw how they destroyed cupboards, tables, anything. You saw the brutal, the sheer brutality of it, and you saw you could see the faces of the inhabitants that were lined up for the police mugshots that they did. And of course, these photos were photos of the perpetrators. So we were very much discussing, should we use them or should we not use them? And then we decided to use them in a different format. So we made them small, but still showed them, because we thought this is about the violence. It's about the destruction. And it's, of course, we know all the photos of the destruction of windows, of shops and everything. But this also included the humans behind it and the destruction of and intruding of the privacy in it. So that was
one way, and
but we made it very small. Yeah, another thing. Yeah, Rwanda.
Right. In another.
Rwanda, yeah. No, we did a play on Rwanda, and then we were thinking about, do we show the atrocities or not? And there was a break in between, and you had to go from one space to another. And we also decided to make the photos like Briefmarken.
Like yes, very
stamps.
Yeah, very small. So it was your decision to really step and watch close or step away from it. So you had to.
Not a general impression. Yeah.
And then another strategy we had in the play was that it's also with Rwandan genocide, and we deal a lot with killings with the Armenian genocide, and we had pictures, but we didn't show them to the audience. So the actor is looking at the picture and he is describing the picture, but he's not showing the picture to the audience. So the actor gets into the process of describing it, and he really gets into it very in detail. It's very difficult to listen to it, that you don't see the picture. So it's depending on you what kind of image you create in your head. But we will not show you the picture, because then it can become like pornography with violence. So it's really difficult to deal with that. But on the other hand, if you deal with these issues, you have to deal with this, because it's part of the story. So you have to look for a way how to get it in the play according to the aesthetics you're dealing with.
Thank you.
I think for me, because we have been only portrayed only portrayed through the newspaper, through nightly TV news in the 60s and the early 70s, only a horror. And so the way we Vietnamese have been presented throughout, and that's how the world saw us, was through horror. And so maybe that this is why, and I'm trying to kind of counter those images, those representation of us. And you can see those images fragmented, and they're trying to form into something to counter all this. And I think maybe that's part of my strategy, is to kind of fragment them in order to kind of kind of allow us to contemplate them more indifferently. But I think even my work here, it's been criticized by the younger generation of artists for focusing too much on the Vietnam War, because they want to move forward. They want the world to see Vietnam, as a modern country, or as a country trying to modernize itself to move away from the Vietnam War. My position is that I need to understand this, because I somehow end up in the middle of this, was born in the middle of it, and I have no idea, why it happened. And the next thing I know, I was in a refugee camp in America. And so all this question I need to answer. But the younger generation now, they're like, why are you so obsessed with this? Why are you so obsessed with the war? And they want to move on. They want to talk about, maybe sexuality, maybe something else. And this is where it's really interesting. It depends on, which generation you are and what memory, where you come from in terms of, And I think, you're working with this many Vietnamese living in Europe. And this is also another really kind of fascinating thing that's happening now, is that because many of the Vietnamese living or going to study in Europe, they all come from different perspectives. And I have friends who are a professor in university in America, and they're teaching the Vietnamese American, and they're teaching about the Vietnam War in the university school. And the Vietnamese who come from Vietnam and travel to America to study, and the Vietnamese who parents immigrate or escape to end up in America. And what happened was that the two have completely different experiences, because the one from Vietnam, the history have been censored highly, and so they come from a very different perspective. And then, then the Vietnamese who are, some of them were born in America, or some of them came very young to America. They heard all this story from their parents, and all the thing that happened. And when these two groups are in the class, they fought against one another because their experience is so vastly different. Their knowledge of the war is so vastly different. And it's quite interesting, and this is where I think, I don't know the group you're working on, but because, it's going to be like that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good reminder. I think probably partly our team did assume the atrocity was not confronted by probably our group of audience, because they are too far, too young, so on and so forth. But that becomes just harmless things in the films or in some magazines or something. Thank you very much. Kat, is there something from you or from the audience?
I do have a few things, maybe too many things, but since this is a special event for Saigon, I would just ask if anyone from the audience would like to ask the speakers something, give a comment.
If possible, we would like to see them. We are so lonely in Germany,
Yeah.
in our homes.
So would anyone like to ask something? Please do not move your computer because it's it connects to all of our system.
I'm
I
sorry,
might-
Dean. If it's not possible, it's fine. Maybe we can.
Yeah,
we are
okay.
fine with some photos afterwards.
We have an audience member with a question. Would you mind just like come here so that we can all see you? Yeah? Let's go. And also you can use this microphone so that you're heard.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for all of your sharing. I was really inspired by your works and also your comments on this work. Actually, my question would be something follow up with the follow up with some of the ideas that our speaker just proposed. So I heard artists they mention the concept of space. Right, the space where people actually come and like see how the possible narrative are laid out, and also the question with like working with groups of young people who approach different story and perspective, and I also had the same experiences. And then I'm working with also like a group of young Americans who only know the story to Apocalypse Now. Oh, no, not even Apocalypse Now. They know it from X-Men. Yeah, they told me that we work on a project on the Vietnam War, and they told me that they have just known about the movie through X-Men, and was so surprised. And I have seen like reaction from young people in Vietnam regarding some artwork that deal with this theme. However, I'm also curious for your on your perspective when you like in the state and present this art, like, are the reaction kind of like vastly different from what you see here in Vietnam, or any kind of like mutual feelings that are shared when the audiences come into interaction with your artwork?
Yes, I think in Vietnam, well, it depends on who, I guess. In Vietnam, actually, they haven't seen this work. I have never been able to show this work because the government doesn't allow it in the country. So I remember, this is about, God, it's like 10 years ago. A gallery in Milan published a really kind of nice calendar, with images from this whole from Vietnam to Hollywood series. And so they sent me like 5 copies. And it arrived, and the ministry, I think it was the Ministry of Culture or something like that, they stop it. They won't allow it inside the country. And I was so pissed. I was like, what's going on? So I went up to the censor office, and I was like, why? And they said that there are images of the helicopters in there, of the American helicopter in there. And I'm like, but there's a museum, down the block that have a full display of an actual Huey helicopter. And so is the museum, the city museum have one. But I think they didn't understand the work. These people, they don't understand contemporary art, so they have no idea what it is. And they don't want to take a chance. It's their job on the line if something happened. So that's, in many ways, the perspective of the government. They don't like what I do because they don't understand it. It's too abstract. It's nothing concrete, and it can be, I think they fear that it can be misinterpreted. In terms of Vietnamese audience here, I don't know, because we never show the work. In America, the Vietnamese American really like the work. I think the Americans like the work a lot. And it was shown widely in America, and actually because it was so was so shown so many times in America that when the Venice Biennale, this was in 2006 or something like that, Francesco Bonami was the curator, and he saw the work. I think it was he saw the work in Chicago, and he brought it to the Venice Biennale. So I think because here is like find something, a new perspective of the Vietnam War. It's not dominated by Hollywood, and that it's finally it's a different voice, a different perspective, and I think that's why this series was so was shown everywhere for many years, and it's still much of it is in museum collection, and primarily American museum collection.
I think that question also applied to Regine and Hans-Werner. Would you like to say something in addressing how the audience has been receiving your work?
Sorry, could you repeat the question for us? Because it was very difficult.
Yeah, it was not very clear.
Just a very short version of the beautiful question. How did the audience, different audiences, received your work?
How they receive the work. Well, I would say any one of those who watch a performance is perceiving the work differently. With Tripping Stone State Theatre, we were lucky enough to have a lot of talks with very different audiences. So what we got out of this was that everybody tries to find something valuable or transferable to their own situations. And I think that's actually what I would strive for and say, well, theater has the or can be a space for these kinds of negotiations or sharings, or so every audience. Well, I'm not sure whether I really get the question. There was, well, none of the audiences really stepped out of or left the theater space in anger. I wouldn't really remember, but there was one, yeah, maybe this story, but this is not an audience. That's a single with the play about the Armenian genocide, because this is just one very emotional reaction.
Well, we did a play once about the Armenian genocide, and one of the perpetrators, one of the persons who were in charge, was killed in Berlin. He was shot in Berlin. And so there was a trial in Berlin. And so what we did, we used the transcript of the trial against the murderer, and we transformed this into a play. And
one thing which we should say is there was a large, there's a large Turkish community in Berlin. So the Armenian genocide, not for everyone, is a given.
That's true.
A given issue.
It's a hot issue.
Historical fact.
So and during and what we did it with 4 actors and actresses, and we changed the characters all the time. But in one sequence of the play, one of the actresses she gives the statement of a state attorney, and she says when the genocide was happening, the Turkish people did not know that, and they didn't want this. And there was someone shouting from the audience, "That's not true." And then there was deadly silence in the theater because you have no idea what's going to happen next. And nothing was happening. So after a few seconds, which feel like ages, the show continued. But after the show, there came an old man, came to us, and he said there was this shouting during your show when the lady said that the Turkish people did not know.
And he was very upset.
He was very upset
about the shouting, and then he recognized that it was himself who shouted. So that was just
he said
very.
He said it was me shouting because my dead people. I have so many dead people in my family. They are so close under my skin that it broke out of me, and I had to say it. And coming back to the point of the question, I think the kind of theater what Regine and I are doing, it's usually it's developed for one city, for one theater, for one place, and people respond to it, as Betty said in the beginning, because they know the situation of the city, and so they can relate to it. It works in other places as well because it's so detailed and so precise that you can say we are analyzing systems. And these systems, of course, you can transfer to other things. And so the audience can connect. But this kind of theater, what we do is, it's quite challenging for the audience because you have to, you have to listen carefully, and you can experience a lot, but it's a lot of details, but it creates a lot of different stories. So you have to find your position as well in listening to the play, in experiencing the play. And so you become like your own producer. And of course, that's challenging for the audience because it's not, I think it's entertaining, but not everybody would say it's entertaining. And so you can work with it. You can work with things, what the actors work on in the play.
This has to do because we are interested in having clashing now in clash different perspectives. We are not really interested. We are interested in creating questions, not providing answers. We cannot provide the answers. We want to provide a space where you can negotiate, where you can discuss, where things are not black and white, where things are not decided for the audience. Instead, the audience is very often or mostly in a situation where they have to make constant decisions. For example, the Tripping Stones, we used texts which were National Socialist texts. There was for example, we used a text about Kleist, and the National Socialists, of course, reread the German classics, the German classic literature or the German classic drama, and we used this, but we are framing it with other perspectives. Of course, we have our own standpoint. That's not in question, but we like to not take the audience by their hands. So
maybe you could say it in a way that it's better to challenge the audience than to make them asleep. So
it's probably not the answer to the question. I'm not sure.
I know we're a little bit longer than how the we're good, Betty. Yeah. So I would just like to take this opportunity to ask something that I really would like to know as a maker, as someone who does want to make something. with the kind of material that I am having, but looking at history, memory, we as human beings are practically driven by what we either remember or try to forget, and also to be able to step in it and do something about this whole history, personal history and collective history. It requires a lot of effort, and also it requires a sort of platform, a sort of distribution capacity even for our work to be placed on and then to be viewed. So it does sound like a very large task. It's gigantic. So I would just really like to ask you, if one wants to start tackling this task of going into history and memory and do something about it, where should they start? Give us an advice on where to start. Youngsters who want to do stuff, maybe, yeah. Hans-Werner and Regine, you want to take this first, please?
Well, in the end, it comes down to very simple things. You start doing the work, you invest time, you invest your lifetime, and you're given the pleasure of, you find out a lot of things. You find out things which you haven't thought of. You don't think that this is possible. And so but doing this kind of work it's a gift, because you learn a lot. You learn a lot about society, you learn a lot about yourself, and it's and you always have something to do, because it's always changing. There's so much going on that well, it's never boring. You always can work on something.
My advice would be follow your curiosity and follow your questions. That's where the path is. And start digging. You will find anything to start with.
Yeah, didn't you wanna...
I agreed. Start with something that you're curious, you're interested in, something small. But what I really learned over the years is that, I never intended the last 20 years of my life have been about the Vietnam War. It was just, I just started because I want to understand it, I want to know, but over the years, the research is really kind of fascinating. You do research on one project, it led to another project. It led to another project because it's all connected. And, it's like along the way you read something that might not be connected to this project completely, but it left an impression. And when you're done with this project, you will come back to that little snippet of information and you dig. And it's just this kind of passion that's just like, that kind of led you because you're curious and you want to know and you want to understand. And you just start. I mean, I think that's what you need to do, is just start with something and it will take you down the rabbit hole. I really believe that.
Thank you. So, yeah, maybe Betty, you want to bring us to the...
I mean, yeah, thank you so much. I see there is a lot of common understanding about, also sort of can understand trust question, because I think when the first time I encounter Hans-Werner and Regine's work, I, on the one hand, marvel at the work and the workload. On the other hand, also thought, well, it's because of the German archiving system is so impressive. And if you're in a place where archives are but then I think there are always other ways. So like there can be always somewhere something, and then like my personal experience, and many people start with just visiting the people, even if it's not archives, no. And so there must be something. So I think that's great. And yeah, I think that's Actually, I mean, Tra, you can wrap up. Usually I wrap it up with a little advertisement for the festival that is coming up. But unfortunately, because our wonderful audience in Saigon cannot participate, but you can participate our digital program. So all you need to do is go to SPIA's website, which hopefully Ta can tell you about it. And it's always bilingual, English, German, and then everything from today's talk, from previous talk, and the talks to come. 29th of September, we have another one where the artists are from Taiwan and Hong Kong. Yeah, they will all be online. And also, actually, our previous talks from the previous edition of SPIA also would be online. So it's simply a resource material, and it's all in English. Yeah. So welcome. Yeah, that's all I want to say, Tra. Thank you, everybody. Thank our artists and thank our audience and wonderful people that make this happen.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you so much, Hans-Werner and Regine and Dinh. Thank you so much. I learned so much that I'm feeling a bit too privileged now. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. We hope that you have learned it as much as we did. Oh, a photo of it here. Oh, okay, later. Okay, go to Spielart website and check it out. There's a link to Dinh's video. We can also put it on there for people to peruse later on. So yeah, with that, thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you online or in Munich. Thank you. Thank you.